You've probably heard of the Ottoman Empire, but what if I told you it all started not in a grand city or palace, but in the dusty frontier lands of Anatolia? No banners, no royal decree, no formal government. Just a small tribe surrounded by enemies with a leader driven by vision and survival. This is the beginning, the unlikely birth of one of the most powerful empires in human history. The year is around 1299. The Seljuk Sultanate of Rum, which once dominated much of Anatolia, is crumbling under the weight of Mongol invasions. It's a time of chaos. Local warlords and tribal leaders scramble to hold on to their land. Into this volatile world steps a man named Ertuğrul. He's the chief of a small Turkish tribe, the Kayi. His people are nomadic, living off the land, herding livestock, and engaging in border skirmishes. Ertuğrul gains favor with the Seljuks, is granted land near the Byzantine border, and settles there. But when he dies, the spotlight turns to his son, Osman. Now, Osman was no ordinary tribal leader. He had something different, a sense of destiny. A legend says he had a dream where a tree grew from his chest and its branches shaded the world. A holy man interpreted this as a divine sign. Osman would build an empire. Whether that story is true or not doesn't matter. What matters is that Osman believed it, and he acted on it. Osman saw opportunity. The Byzantine Empire, though ancient, was now weak and divided. The Seljuks were falling apart. Osman began to raid nearby Byzantine towns, but not for loot alone. He offered captured land to his followers. He welcomed refugees from other tribes. He treated conquered Christians with relative tolerance. This earned him loyalty not just from his own people, but from outsiders too. His community grew, not just in numbers, but in purpose. By the early 1300s, Islam had established a solid power base. And here's a twist. Instead of declaring himself a king, he styled himself as a Ghazi, a holy warrior of Islam. This gave his raids religious legitimacy. He wasn't just expanding territory, he was fulfilling divine duty. Other Ghazis flocked to his cause, and by the time he died in 1324, his small beylik, a Turkish principality, had become a true force on the Anatolian frontier. Enter his son Orhan. While Osman laid the foundation, Orhan built the house, and his first big move, taking the city of Bursa in 1326. This wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. Bursa became the Ottoman capital, a real city, a base of administration, with walls, markets, mosques. It marked the transition from tribe to state. Orhan also did something critical. He introduced coins. You may think that's minor, but think about it. Issuing money is one of the clearest signals of sovereignty. It says, we are not just warriors, we are rulers. We have a system. And with that system came further expansion. So how did this tiny border tribe go from small skirmishes to ruling cities? A few reasons. First, geography. They were located right at the fault line between Islam and Christianity, near the weakened Byzantine lands. They could expand without resistance from powerful Muslim neighbors, because to the east, other Turkish and Mongol states were fighting each other. Second, strategy. Osman and Orhan didn't try to conquer huge cities right away. They took small fortresses, cut supply lines, and used diplomacy. They married into rival families. They promised protection to Christians who didn't resist. And they governed with surprising flexibility. Third, vision. Osman saw himself not just as a tribal leader, but as the founder of something bigger. Orhan built schools, mosques, and administrative centers. They weren't just taking land, they were building a state structure. And they kept their military agile and loyal. Now here's something important. The Ottomans didn't just inherit old traditions, they fused them. They blended Turkish nomadic heritage, Islamic law, Persian administrative practices, and even elements from the Byzantines themselves. This flexibility would become one of the empire's greatest strengths. And what about the name Ottoman? It comes from Osman's name, spelled Uthman in Arabic, so his followers were known as the Osmanli or Ottomans. It's that simple, a name born from a single man's ambition that would go on to define centuries of global politics. By the mid-1300s, the Ottomans had secured a foothold in both Anatolia and the Balkans. They crossed the Dardanelles into Europe. This was huge. Most empires either dominated Asia or Europe, not both. The Ottomans would soon control parts of both continents, becoming a true transcontinental empire. And all of this started with a man and his tribe on the edge of collapse. No royal blood, no vast armies, just vision, timing, and unshakable belief. But make no mistake, this was only the beginning. What came next would shake the foundations of empires, a military machine, a cultural explosion. A city that had defied invaders for 1,000 years would fall, and the Ottoman name would echo from Morocco to Mecca to Vienna. That's what we'll explore in the next part, the rise of the Ottoman military juggernaut and how it used more than swords to build an empire. When we think of empires expanding, we often picture brutal wars, clashing armies and thunderous sieges, and yes, the Ottoman Empire had plenty of that. But its rise wasn't just about blood and steel. It was about innovation, about smart strategies, systems that turned enemies into allies, and tools of war the world had never seen before. This is how the Ottomans didn't just expand, but exploded across 3 continents. Let's go back to the early 14th century. Osman and Orhan had planted the seeds of empire. But those seeds needed more than just ambition to grow. They needed a system, something that would turn tribal warriors into a disciplined, unstoppable force. That's where the Ottomans made their first genius move. They professionalized the army. One of the earliest and most important innovations was the Janissary Corps. And this wasn't your average army. These were elite soldiers, highly trained, fiercely loyal, and raised by the state. How did they get them? Through the controversial Devshirme system. Here's how it worked. The Ottomans would go into their Christian Balkan territories and take young boys, usually aged 8 to 18, from their families. These boys were then converted to Islam, forbidden to marry, and rigorously trained in military discipline or administrative leadership. The best of them became Janissaries, shock troops who were feared across the battlefield. The smartest became viziers or governors. Sounds harsh? It was, but it was also effective. The Janissaries had no ties to any family, tribe, or noble house. Their only loyalty was to the Sultan, and that made them one of the most stable and effective fighting forces in history. Now, while other kingdoms were still relying on feudal levies, farmers turned into part-time soldiers, the Ottomans were building a standing army. An army always ready, always equipped, always deadly. But they didn't just stop at elite troops. The Ottomans built a multi-layered military machine. There were the Sipahi, elite cavalrymen granted land in exchange for military service. These men were the empire's shock cavalry, charging into battle in full armor. There were the Azaps, irregular troops used for siege warfare and risky missions. There were the Topku, the artillery corps. And that brings us to another Ottoman superweapon, gunpowder. While many medieval powers clung to swords and crossbows, the Ottomans were quick to adopt gunpowder technology. They didn't just use cannons, they built super cannons. The most famous? The one that brought down Constantinople in 1453. It was so massive, it took 60 oxen to move and could fire a stone ball over a mile. That cannon broke through the supposedly unbreakable Theodosian walls of the Byzantine capital, ending an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years. That moment wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. By taking Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed the Conqueror, now controlled the crossroads of Europe and Asia, trade routes, military routes, religious routes, all under Ottoman hands. He didn't destroy the city, he revived it, repopulated it, and renamed it Istanbul, and it became the glittering jewel of the empire for centuries. From there, the Ottomans moved fast. They took the Balkans, Syria, Egypt, the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, parts of North Africa, even parts of modern-day Ukraine and Hungary. At their peak, the Ottomans controlled territory from the Persian Gulf to the gates of Vienna. And they didn't just rely on brute force. They used a flexible system of rule. In newly conquered lands, they often left local leaders in place as long as they pledged loyalty and paid taxes. Religious minorities like Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their faith through the millet system, self-governing religious communities that reported to the Sultan but ran their own affairs. This made people more willing to live under Ottoman rule. Another clever strategy? Marriage alliances. Sultans often married daughters of rival leaders to secure loyalty. Or they gave positions of power to local elites to turn enemies into allies. And let's not forget the navy. In the 16th century, under admirals like Hayreddin Barbarossa, the Ottoman navy dominated the Mediterranean. They fought off Spanish and Portuguese fleets, challenged Venetian power, and controlled critical sea routes for trade and military movement. So what does all this tell us? The Ottomans didn't become powerful just because they were violent. They became powerful because they were organized. They created systems, military, political, and economic, that allowed them to scale, to move fast, to hold diverse populations together without constant rebellion, to build loyalty not just through fear, but through infrastructure. They also built fortresses, roads, bridges, and mosques everywhere they went. Ottoman architecture blended Persian, Byzantine, and Islamic styles. Cities became more than just military bases. They became cultural hubs. But perhaps most importantly, the Ottomans knew how to adapt. They borrowed the best ideas from the civilizations around them. From Arabic science to Persian administration to European weapons, the Ottomans were constantly absorbing and evolving. By the 1500s, under Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire's military and administrative systems were so strong it seemed unstoppable. It had momentum, resources, legitimacy, and sheer size on its side. But as we'll soon see, what makes an empire strong can also become its weakness. Systems that work at one stage can become rigid. Elite core, like the Janissaries, can become too powerful, too political. A flexible rule can give way to corruption, and an empire built on conquest eventually runs out of land to conquer. Still, there's no denying this part of the story. The Ottomans expanded not by accident, but through a calculated mixture of innovation, discipline, and tolerance. That's what made them one of the most formidable forces in world history. In the next part of this series, we'll look at the Golden Age, when the Ottomans reached their cultural, political, and military peak under Suleiman. How did they manage such vast territory? What was daily life like inside this superpower? And how did an empire so rooted in war also produce poetry, law, and art? When we talk about the pinnacle of the Ottoman Empire, its golden age, its brightest moment, its most admired leader, there's one name that stands above all others: Suleiman the Magnificent. He ruled for 46 years, and during that time, the Ottoman Empire wasn't just strong, it was sophisticated, powerful, elegant, feared, admired, and unlike anything else in the world. So who was this man that elevated an empire into legend? Born in 1494 in the city of Trabzon on the Black Sea coast, Suleiman was the son of Sultan Selim I, a fierce conqueror who expanded Ottoman territory dramatically in just 8 years. When Selim died in 1520, Suleiman ascended the throne at just 26 years old. And no one, not even his advisors, expected him to become one of the most successful rulers in all of history. But Suleiman wasn't just a soldier. He was a scholar, a poet, a lawmaker. He spoke multiple languages: Arabic, Persian, Turkish, Serbian. He admired Alexander the Great. And, like Alexander, he had a vision that stretched beyond borders and battlefields. The empire he inherited was already vast, but he had bigger plans. In the early years of his reign, Suleiman moved fast. He invaded Hungary, crushed their army at the Battle of Mohacs in 1526, and claimed most of Central Europe as Ottoman land. Then he set his sights on Vienna, the gateway to the heart of Europe. Though the siege of Vienna in 1529 ultimately failed, it sent shockwaves through the West. The Ottomans weren't just an Eastern Empire anymore. They were knocking on the doors of Christian Europe. But Suleiman's genius wasn't just military. It was administrative, it was legal, it was cultural. Inside his empire, he initiated sweeping reforms to ensure stability. He reorganized the tax system to make it more fair and predictable. He updated land laws to reduce corruption. He enforced justice not just through force, but through structure. That's why in the Islamic world, he's often remembered not as Suleiman the Magnificent, but as Suleiman the Lawgiver. He didn't just rule by sword, he ruled by pen. He sponsored hundreds of architectural projects: palaces, bridges, schools, mosques. His chief architect, Mimar Sinan, created masterpieces that still stand today. The most famous? The Süleymaniye Mosque in Istanbul. A stunning combination of engineering and artistry, a symbol of power, yes, but also of peace, balance, and divine order. Under Suleiman, Istanbul became a jewel of the world. Traders, scholars, artists, and thinkers flooded into the city. The markets bustled with goods from across Africa, Asia, and Europe. Spices, silks, gems, coffee. It wasn't just a capital, it was the heartbeat of a multicultural empire. And this empire wasn't ruled by a single ethnicity or religion. Turks, Arabs, Greeks, Armenians, Kurds, Jews, Slavs all lived under Ottoman rule. Each had their place in the empire's vast, structured society. The millet system allowed religious communities to govern themselves in matters of family law and worship. So a Greek Orthodox Christian could settle disputes through his own church. A Jew could use a rabbinical court, and a Muslim through Sharia. This system didn't create perfect equality, but it gave a sense of order and autonomy that kept the empire relatively stable. Now here's where the story takes a dramatic turn. Because Suleiman's greatest challenge wasn't foreign enemies, it was within his own palace. Enter Hürrem Sultan, also known as Roxelana. She was a slave girl, captured from modern-day Ukraine, who rose to become Suleiman's wife and most trusted advisor. That alone broke Ottoman tradition. Sultans were supposed to father children with concubines, not marry them. But Suleiman changed the rules. Hürrem was intelligent, strategic, and deeply involved in politics. Together they had multiple children, but this sparked tension and rivalry in the royal court. One of the greatest tragedies of Suleiman's reign was the execution of his eldest son, Mustafa, a popular and capable prince, who was accused, possibly falsely, of plotting against his father. Suleiman ordered his death. It's a haunting reminder that even in a golden age, power comes at a cost, and even great rulers must make impossible decisions. As Suleiman aged, he continued to lead military campaigns personally, even in his 70s. In 1566, on his final campaign in Hungary, he died in his tent during the siege of Szigetvar. But here's something remarkable. His death was kept secret for weeks to prevent chaos in the ranks. His body was embalmed, his heart and internal organs were buried on the battlefield. His legacy? Immortalized in both East and West. So why was this era called the Golden Age? It wasn't just about expansion, it was about balance. Suleiman balanced tradition with reform, force with fairness, art with administration. He didn't just conquer lands, he cultivated them, he made them work. And that's what made the Ottoman Empire understood as nations before World War I. And almost all of them were stitched together with little regard for religion, ethnicity, or history. The consequences? Still unfolding today. The legacy of the Ottomans is complex. On one hand, they presided over centuries of relative peace in diverse lands. They built magnificent cities. They created systems that allowed Jews, Christians, and Muslims to live side by side, often more peacefully than in Europe. Their art, music, poetry, and architecture continue to inspire. On the other hand, they resisted change. They crushed dissent, they ruled with an iron hand, and in their final years, their desperation led to atrocities and devastation. But maybe that's what makes this story so powerful. The Ottoman Empire wasn't just good or bad, it was human, glorious, flawed, capable of beauty and horror, wisdom and pride, brilliance and blindness. And like all empires, it ended. Not with a bang, but with a slow fade, a final gasp, and the birth of something new. So next time you hear about Istanbul, or Turkey, or conflicts in the Middle East, remember, the shadow of the Ottoman Empire is still there, in the borders, in the ruins, in the languages and laws and cultures. Because history never really disappears, it just changes form. If this journey through the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire taught you something, inspired you, or made you see the world in a new way, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. What part of this empire's story surprised you the most? And if you're hungry for more, stick around. Because from the ashes of one empire to the rise of the next, we're telling the stories that shaped the world, one epic at a time.